really young, but he's really brilliant, and he should be reviewing films for you. And this was Geoff, who's not any longer quite so young. He went on very quickly to be programming films for what became TIFF. Geoff has worked, is presently at the Globe and Mail. He was 12 years at the Toronto Star before that. He was 12 years at CTV AM, is that right? He was many years at TVO. He has done everything. He's written 4 books, one of them on Don Chabib's Going Down the Road that we saw last week. There's probably not a Canadian film that he hasn't seen since the 80s. So although you want to talk about this film, and I encourage you to do so, if there's anything else you want to know. One comment is that Canada is full of film reviewers, but there are very few real film critics. And Geoff is one, and he's not being paid to be the other. Geoff Pevere.
I'll sit here. Okay, great. I was, first of all, delighted to hear that everybody who spoke up said that you liked it or you found it interesting, and I think you all found it engaging. Because not all movies, especially when they're produced in a particular period, not always. Sometimes it's kind of like, what were we thinking, back in those days. But I do think that the Apprenticeship of Duddy Kravitz is a film that still has an awful lot of strength to it, and an awful lot of, I think, immediacy to it. I hadn't seen it, when I watched it recently, I hadn't seen it for quite a long time. And it reminded me that when this film was completed in 1974, it was unusual in that it was something of an event. And it wasn't very often that movies made in Canada by Canadians were considered events, But this one was. And it was interesting because I remember, even before the movie was released, I remember seeing stories of the film's production in Montreal. Many interviews with Mordecai Richler, and of course there were an awful lot that kind of dealt with the very long friendship between Mordecai Richler and the director Ted Kotcheff. And that is that's an important part of this story as well, because what you're looking at is a collaboration between two men who know each other very, very, very well. And in fact, their story is interesting too, because it tells you a little bit about the Canada that they were born in, that they grew up in. Richler in Montreal, Ted Kotcheff in Toronto. And when they met each other, interestingly enough, it was in Paris. They were among a generation of Canadians who had ambitions to be writers, to be filmmakers, and if you were in Canada at that time and you had those ambitions, you probably considered leaving the country. Because there was practically no film industry. There was very little support for Canadian writers, and Richler wanted, of course, to be a novelist. And Kotcheff was one of the youngest directors to work for the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation in the 1950s. I mean, he was actually a director at the CBC when he was 24, 25 years old. And he stayed at the CBC, and at the CBC, he learned that's where he learned his skills as a filmmaker. It is also where I think Kotcheff began to develop a very keen appreciation for writing. And he is also someone who, one of the reasons he left to go to England is he felt that if he stayed in Canada, all he was going to do was to be working at the CBC, and he didn't want to do that for the rest of his life. And he also wanted to work in theater, and as far as he was concerned, the best English theater in the world was in England. And so he went to England, and as I say, he and Richler just kind of met by accident in Paris, a couple of Canadians who were abroad looking for things to do. Richler felt that the publishing industry was not sort of sufficiently supportive, and he felt like he might have more success as a novelist in England. So the two of them returned, they struck up a friendship in Paris, moved to England, and actually lived together as roommates. They lived together as roommates. In fact, Ted Kotcheff was living with Mordecai Richler when he was writing the book, The Apprenticeship of Duddy Kravitz. The second person, as the story goes, to read the manuscript was Ted Kotcheff. And he said to Richler, this is in 1959, when the book was first written, he said to him at that point, he said, Mordecai, this is an absolutely incredible, this might be the best Canadian novel ever. And he said, and I really want to make this into a film. So at that point, the idea began. Now that's 1959. That's many years, 16 years before the film was actually made. Throughout those years, Richler, of course, his status grew as a novelist. He returned to Montreal from England. Kotcheff's career he stayed and directed a lot of theater in England. He directed a couple of his first movies in England as well. And interestingly enough, the first work that he did in Canada since leaving the CBC was directing The Apprenticeship of Duddy Kravitz in 1973. The script was written by Mordecai Richler and with the help of Lionel Chetwynd. And one of the things that Kotcheff has talked about is working very, very closely with Richler on the adaptation. And Kotcheff also had some very, very, very interesting ideas about sort of what would work in a novel but might not work on screen, for example. And so there were very sort of slight changes left. But for the most part, if you've read the book, the movie does honor the text, and is very much I think a very faithful adaptation, not only in terms of narrative but in spirit to the novel itself. Now, when the movie was finally done, as I said, it was unusual because there was an awful lot of press generated by the making of this film. The thing I remember, and this will tell you something about being a teenager in Canada when I was a number of years ago, the thing I remember was that it was a Canadian movie that was actually playing in a movie theater. That was unusual. Canadian movies didn't play in our movie theaters. Very, very rarely. We have grown up, I grew up with Hollywood movies. It wasn't until I basically saw Canadian films on television and saw them in classrooms, those kinds of places, but they almost never played at a cinema that you actually went and bought a ticket for. And what I remember was that year in 1974, it was kind of amazing because I actually paid to see 2 Canadian movies in theaters that year. One was The Apprenticeship of Duddy Kravitz, and the other was a horror movie called Black Christmas. And I remember that at that time, there was a lot of talk that the Canadian film industry, and a lot of this was kind of was generated by the very positive reviews and critical reception that The Apprenticeship of Duddy Kravitz was getting. There was a real sense that, finally, Canadian film has come of age. And what that usually means is English Canadian film, right? We're not talking about French Canadian film, which has always been a kind of a separate cultural phenomenon and a separate industry, and has never faced quite the same challenges of finding an audience that the English Canadian film has, because we speak the same language as Hollywood. And so there was a lot of talk that when The Apprenticeship of Duddy Kravitz came out, that this was going to be a breakthrough for Canadian film, that this was going to lead to all kinds of Canadian films, English Canadian films, that were then going to be critically celebrated, shown around the world, and will open in movie theaters. And it didn't really happen. It didn't really happen, but certainly I mention that because every few years it seemed that there was a film that was going to do it. There was a film that was going to break through. Going Down the Road, for example, was one that was considered that. It was considered that for a while. And the interesting thing about The Apprenticeship of Duddy Kravitz is that it did play successfully in very many different countries. It was turned down by the Cannes Film Festival, but it won the top award at the Berlin Film Festival, which was very interesting. At that point in time, it generated more money at the box office than any Canadian film ever had. It was since surpassed by movies like Meatballs later on, and Porky's. But certainly at the time, Duddy Kravitz was considered a critical success and a popular success. Immediately, Richler and Kotcheff decided they wanted to work again. And that what they wanted to do is they wanted to make a film of another Richler novel. But it also tells you something about the difficulty that was so consistently faced by filmmakers in Canada in that they couldn't raise money. Here they had made, their collaboration had been the most successful English-Canadian film ever made, and they couldn't raise money. They couldn't raise money. They couldn't raise the money that they needed to make this film. And so Kotcheff, actually, he left and went and began a very successful career working in Hollywood. So the interesting thing about The Apprenticeship of Duddy Kravitz also is that it was for the longest time, it was a film that was considered one of the best that this country had ever produced. It's interesting that the Toronto International Film Festival, I don't know if it still does it, but they used to do those decade, every 10 years, it was 10 best Canadian films, and they would poll critics around the world to find out what their 10 favorite Canadian films of all time are. Because when it was first done in 1984, Apprenticeship of Duddy Kravitz was in the top 10. When it was done again, about 10 years later, it was still on the list. And it hasn't appeared since then. It's kind of like it's sort of dropped off that list. I'm not really sure why. But I think that what's really interesting to me about the film is that certainly there had been a lot of films that had been made in the 60s and the 70s, particularly French films set in Montreal. This was one of the very first English films that I had seen set in Montreal. And also the emphasis on the very rich and diverse Jewish community in Montreal was something that was really quite remarkable. And at that point in time, I hadn't read the book. I have since then. But it was very interesting to me to kind of see the extent to which the adaptation was a very faithful one. But the other interesting thing is that after the film was released, it became quite controversial. Mordecai Richler was accused of anti-Semitism. And a lot of the Jewish community in Montreal did not like the film. They did not like the character of Duddy Kravitz at all. They did not find him in any way a positive role model, and he's not really, I guess. And the film, therefore, was consistently, not all the time, but was consistently being criticized for anti-Semitism, for portraying a negative image of Duddy's character being a negative image of a striving young Jewish man. Richler always sort of brushed that off. He said, no, this is somebody I knew. This is somebody I grew up with. These are characters I know. And whether or not you like them, it doesn't matter. They are people that he said that he drew from his own experience. One of the very interesting things is that when it came to casting the role of Duddy Kravitz, there was an agent who was working with an actor in New York, and whose movie career was just starting. A young guy, he's 26 years old, by the name of Richard Dreyfuss. And at that point in time, Geoff was told to go and see Richard Dreyfuss in a movie called American Graffiti, which you might have heard, George Lucas is one of his first films. And when Geoff saw Richard Dreyfuss in American Graffiti, he said, this guy's absolutely wrong. This is no Duddy Kravitz, this is not it at all. But the agent insisted that, that Dreyfuss be allowed to read for the part. If you can see him read for the part, you'll see what I'm talking about. And Dreyfuss made American Graffiti in 1973 and made this movie in 1974, and then he made a little movie about a great white shark called Jaws in 1975. So within a year of making this film, Richard Dreyfuss was one of the biggest movie stars in the world. What's very interesting is that he, for 20 years, he hated his performance in this movie. He hated it. He wouldn't talk about the film. He got upset when he was asked about it. He said he couldn't watch himself in it. He hated his performance in it, which is interesting because I think it's a terrific performance. I think it's an amazing performance, and it could be that he was so good at being Duddy that he doesn't even like himself. You know, when he saw the performance. But he has since made his peace. The film was restored and given a special presentation at the Cannes Film Festival last May, and both Geoff and Richard Dreyfuss were there to present it. And I'm trying to think if there's anything. There's one other little bit of trivia that I came across that I found very interesting. Actually, there's another version of The Apprenticeship of Duddy Kravitz. It was made in 1961 for British television, if you can imagine. And it was directed by Ted Geoff. That was his first adaptation. I would love to see that. I would especially love to see how a British cast would bring this off. I just love to see that. Anyway, I don't know if it even exists, but